The carbon-carbon double bond is the central feature of alkenes. So when we think of alkene chemistry, we think of the chemistry of the carbon-carbon double bond. And just in terms of big picture thinking, it's not surprising that addition is the key reaction of alkenes. Remember that double bond is made up of two separate bonds. One is a sigma bond, strong, and the other is a pi bond, much weaker. So breaking a weak pi bond and replacing it with two sigma bonds, as I've shown here, just makes sense energetically. We're going downhill. We supply some energy to break the pi bond and get a whole bunch of energy back when we make two sigma bonds. So we start with an alkene and add two things to it. An atom of group of atoms I'll call A, and an atom or a group of atoms I'll call B. Now notice that I've shown the two carbon atoms of the double bond as being different. One has one thing attached to it, the other has two. I did this to make a point. There are two possible orientations for A and B, aren't there? A could attach to the left carbon that has one thing attached to it, or it could attach to the other carbon that has two things attached to it, with B attached to the left-hand carbon as I've shown it here. Furthermore, as we look closely, we see that both of these carbons could be stereogenic centers. We start with neither one being a stereogenic center, but each of them could become a stereogenic center depending on what's attached to that carbon. But when there are four different things attached, we could have stereogenic centers at both of these carbons, the ones I've marked with an asterisk. So now we see that there are two special factors to consider when we look at the products of an alkene addition reaction. One is regioselectivity, meaning position selectivity. Which carbon is A attached to and which carbon is B attached to? We have two possible regioisomers. Are both formed? And if so, in equal amounts? Or is one preferentially formed? Then we have stereochemistry to consider. Are stereoisomers formed? And if so, how many? And if so, is there some preference? Notice the alkene starting compound has stereochemistry. Do you think that will affect the stereochemistry of the products? Well, perhaps. Before we think too deeply about regioselectivity and stereochemistry issues regarding addition to the double bond, let's look at the transformations themselves. What actually happens? It's possible to add water to that alkene double bond. A hydrogen adds to one carbon and hydroxyl to the adjacent carbon. In fact, there are actually three methods for doing this that we'll talk about. It's possible to add hydrogen halide when the halide is chlorine or bromine. Again, hydrogen adds to one carbon. The halide adds to the adjacent carbon. A third possibility puts two halogens on the adjacent carbons. Again, halogen being either chlorine or bromine. And a fourth possibility puts a halogen on one carbon and a hydroxyl on the adjacent carbon. All four of these types of transformations fit in a category of addition reaction called electrophilic addition. We'll talk more about why it's called electrophilic addition and why it makes so much sense for alkenes in a minute. Let me show you three other reactions that don't fit in the same mechanistic category, but nevertheless shouldn't be ignored. It's possible to add two adjacent hydroxyl groups to the double bond to make a diol. In fact, there are two methods for doing this that we'll talk about. It's possible to add two hydrogens. A hydrogen adds to each carbon by a mechanism that's quite different from electrophilic addition. And finally, another reaction that oddly is an addition reaction to begin with, but ends up being cleavage. An alkene can be transformed into two carbonyl compounds, where we've cut the double bond. I'll discuss these three transformations in separate videos. Before we discuss the details of electrophilic addition reactions, let's take a look at the pi bond itself. I've shown the atoms of this alkene all in the plane of the screen. In addition to the two atoms of the double bond itself, there are four other atoms that have to be in the same plane. The two that are attached to this carbon, and the two that are attached to this carbon. To take a better look at the pi bond, which right now is sticking out straight toward us, let's rotate this molecule 90 degrees. So I'll rotate the molecule around an axis like this. That means this number 3 atom here will move back, and this number 4 atom will move up and forward toward us. This number 5 will move up and toward us, and 6 will move back and away from us. So here's what we have. Now those 6 atoms are in a plane that is perpendicular to the plane of the screen. and we have a better perspective to look at the pi bond. First, let's just quickly notice that this sigma bond between the two carbons is formed by sharing a pair of electrons. We're not interested in those electrons, but they're there, forming a strong sigma bond that holds those two carbons together. We're really interested in the pi electrons. That pi bond is formed because two p orbitals line up parallel to each other. They each contain an electron, which can be shared between them when there's overlap of the orbitals, as I've indicated here. So that pi bond sticks above the plane and below the plane that's defined by the 6 atoms of the alkene carbon-carbon double bond. So we see that in addition to the fact that the pi bond is weak, there's a second factor to think about. That pi electron density is readily available for sharing. There's no steric hindrance at all because the electron density sticks out above and below the plane of the alkene. So take a look at this. We can easily predict that an electrophile, remember an electrophile is something that needs a pair of electrons, would be attracted to this pi bond because it has a pair of electrons to share. Using arrow pushing, we would write something like this. To draw this more simply, we can simply draw the alkene in the plane of the screen, reacting with an electrophile. The electrophile forms a sigma bond to a carbon atom, but in the process, that pair of pi electrons is stolen from the other carbon atom, so there's a positive charge there. Carbocations aren't stable. They need to react with something that has a pair of electrons to make a sigma bond. We call those nucleophiles. So without knowing anything for sure, we can still predict that a nucleophile would react with this carbocation, forming a new sigma bond. So with just the initial thinking we've done, we've already been able to write out the major mechanism of the reaction of alkenes, electrophilic addition. First, formation of a sigma bond with an electrophile, followed by formation of a sigma bond with a nucleophile. The electrophile and nucleophile end up on adjacent carbons. Now let's go back to those factors about regioselectivity and stereochemistry that we thought we should talk about. Thinking of regioselectivity now in the context of this mechanism we've just drawn, we see that what we're really asking is, does the electrophile add to the carbon on the left or to the carbon on the right? And as you might guess, that's determined by how stable the carbocations are. Is the more stable carbocation formed by having the electrophile form a sigma bond to the carbon on the left or to the right? And we'll take a look at that. And in terms of the stereochemistry, now that we see there can be an intermediate involved, we see that the answer to the stereochemistry question may be complicated. It may not be as simple as looking at the stereochemistry of the starting alkene. We'll look at both of these factors in the context of each of the reactions we talk about, because it turns out that the regioselectivity and the stereochemistry of these addition reactions depends on exactly which reaction it is. And finally, it's worth asking the question, does all this make sense in terms of the energetics? What does the energy diagram look like? Remember, we're talking about a two-step reaction mechanism. In the initial step, we form a carbocation. We would predict that would be relatively slow because carbocations are unstable. And in the second step, we add the nucleophile. We would predict that's pretty fast because we're making a sigma bond and relieving the positive and negative charges of the carbocation and nucleophile. In fact, the energy diagram reflects this exactly. There are two steps in the reaction mechanism, so there are two humps in the energy diagram. The activation energy for the first step, the slow step, is much larger than the activation energy for the second step. We show the intermediate carbocation, and it's important to notice the transition state for the rate determining step. It's the stability of that transition state that determines how high the activation energy barrier is, which determines how fast the reaction is. And finally, notice that the delta G for this reaction is negative. We're going downhill. With respect to the starting material and product, energy is released. So the overall energetics of the reaction fit our two-step electrophilic addition picture. As I talk about each of the specific reactions in separate videos, we'll see that this same energy diagram applies. A slow first step, an intermediate positively charged ion, and a fast second step.